For 70 passengers heading from Mogadishu to Djibouti, their travel plans were ruined when their flight was cancelled. They were then informed that another airline, Daallo Airlines, would step in to fulfill their flight. What initially seemed to be a blessing turned into disaster, as this flight would be one they had wished they never boarded. To see what's happened and why, stay tuned. It was a typical day at Mogadishu Airport, with travellers weaving through the terminal, their minds occupied with thoughts of distant destinations and reunions to come. 70 passengers arrived at the airport expecting to board a Turkish Airlines flight to Djibouti. Among the many passengers stood a diverse mix of individuals, each with their own reasons for embarking on this journey. Families excitedly chatted amongst themselves, while business travellers checked their watches with a sense of urgency. But for one individual, their reason for travel was much more sinister. For this individual, he was planning for the flight to be a one-way trip. As he passed through security, unbeknownst to the security personnel, or perhaps it was known but we'll find out a little later on, a hidden danger lurked within the confines of a seemingly ordinary laptop. Concealed beneath the surface was an explosive device, a threat waiting to be unleashed. Having successfully passed through the final barrier to stop his plan, it would seem that the inevitable conclusion was now set. Fate now stepped in to put the brakes on his plan. Due to poor weather for the departing Turkish Airlines flight, it was cancelled. What initially seemed like disappointment to the passengers was actually a blessing in disguise. That was until a twist of circumstance and positive planning by Daallo Airlines. They were able to put on the same trip from Mogadishu to Djibouti with just a short delay for the passengers. Their new flight, Daallo Airlines Flight 159, would be on board an Airbus A321, manufactured in 1996. The aircraft was fully serviceable, with the ability to carry 236 passengers. But for this flight, only 74 passengers would be on board. After a short delay, the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Passengers made their way down to the gate, with anticipation building with each step. Little did they know, this routine journey would turn out to be anything but routine. Unaware to the danger that lurked among them, passengers buckled their seatbelts and prepared for takeoff. The individual with the laptop entered the cabin and sat down in seat 16F. This was on the right side of the aircraft, just in front of the wing. The flight's crew were getting ready to depart. The captain had carried out a walk around of the aircraft and was happy with the condition of everything. The first officer meanwhile carried out the initial checks. The crew had a final look at the weather. It was looking fit for their flight. The wind was from 090 at 17 knots. The temperature was 31 degrees Celsius or 88 degrees Fahrenheit, with no significant weather and a pressure setting of 1011 hectopascals. With both flight crew ready and the passengers boarded, the doors were secured and engine start was requested. Shortly after engine start, they were cleared to taxi to the holding point at runway 05. There wasn't too much traffic, so they were able to smoothly move around the airport with minimal delay. After reaching the holding point with checks complete, they reported they were ready for departure. The first officer was the pilot flying, with the captain as the pilot monitoring. They were then given clearance for takeoff. The first officer lined up the aircraft on the centerline and moved the thrust levers forward. The aircraft began its takeoff roll, and at 0835, Daallo Airlines Flight 159 took off for Djibouti. With the airport lacking a radar, the controller asked the crew for their estimated time of arrival to reporting points Salal, Al-Nab and Lutar. The crew responded, and then they were cleared to climb to flight level 300 or 30,000 feet. They input their new cleared altitude, and with the autopilot engaged, selected flight level change with a steady climb speed of 250 knots. With the busy parts fulfilled, the passengers now began to relax and started to settle into their flight. The takeoff and initial climb were complete, and now they had a short while to chill out before starting their descent and arrival into Djibouti. Just 5 minutes after takeoff, the serenity of the flight was shattered as Flight 159 soared to its cruising altitude. Suddenly, a deafening explosion ripped through the cabin, sending shockwaves of terror through the air. Passengers' screams pierced through the smoke as the force of the blast tore a jagged hole in the fuselage. In the midst of the mayhem, the passenger carrying the concealed explosive was hurled out of the aircraft, vanishing into the abyss below. Their malicious intent had unleashed a nightmare upon the unsuspecting travellers. In the flight deck, the explosion occurred as the aircraft was passing through 10,400 feet. The autopilot immediately disconnected, and the captain quickly stated, "I have control," with the first officer acknowledging, "You have control." As the aircraft continued to climb, the captain now lowered the nose and started to turn left back to Mogadishu airport. Whilst the captain was bringing the aircraft under control, a master warning was sounded in the flight deck with the message for excess cabin altitude. This was shown on the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, or ECAM, and this message informed the crew that the altitude pressure within the cabin was greater than 9,550 feet. This was because of the large hole blown into the side of the fuselage, which meant that the cabin could no longer be pressurized, and the pressure was equalizing with the pressure outside of the cabin. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the flight attendants sprung into action, with their training kicking in amongst the chaos. With unwavering composure, they swiftly moved to secure the safety of the other passengers. They assessed the situation, and as the explosion had occurred at a relatively low altitude, the effects of the cabin were minimized. The air was still breathable, and the difference between the pressure inside and outside was so close that the effects of the decompression were manageable. They made the decision to move some of the passengers to the rear of the aircraft, away from the hole in the fuselage. They then noticed that a few passengers near the explosion appeared to be injured and started to deliver first aid. Adding to the stress of the passengers was the deployment of the oxygen masks, but not all of them. Only 68% of the masks deployed across the cabin. This was unusual, as they are to deploy automatically if the cabin altitude was to increase above 14,000 feet. It is likely that due to the dynamic overpressure because of the explosion, some of the oxygen masks were deployed. But from the passengers' point of view, it would have been quite distressing to see some people get an oxygen mask and others not. Luckily for this flight, due to the low passenger numbers, this wasn't a factor and also not necessary due to the low altitude, but an added issue to the psychological effect on the passengers. As the cabin crew were working tirelessly to maintain order, the pilots battled against the odds in the flight deck. Their steady hands guided the stricken aircraft towards safety. Dealing with the master warning, the captain asked the first officer to read the procedures for the emergency from the Flight Crew Operating Manual, or FCOM. The first officer ran through the checks, and still in the left turn, the captain asked the first officer to speak with air traffic control and request clearance to perform an emergency return to Mogadishu. Despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins, the pilots remained steadfast. Their training kicked in with unwavering precision. With the fate of the aircraft and its occupants hanging in the balance, the pilots exemplified the essence of crew resource management. Each decision made with clarity and purpose, each action executed with meticulous precision. Air traffic control acknowledged and approved Flight 159's emergency return, with the first officer providing the aircraft's position and altitude, 17 nautical miles out and now passing through flight level 100. One of the flight attendants now requested access to the flight deck. She informed the pilots of the situation in the cabin and asked if it is dangerous. She also asks what to tell the passengers on what is happening. The captain informs her to tell the passengers that they are flying back to Mogadishu. They are currently stable, it is not dangerous, and that they are going to land in 15 minutes. The flight crew now received a further ECAM alert for the safety valve open. The safety valves prevent cabin pressure from going too high, 8.6 psi above ambient, or too low, 1 psi below ambient. They are located at the rear pressure bulkhead above the flotation line. The ECAM alert was consistent with the activation of the safety valve for more than 1 minute after the dynamic internal overpressure event of the explosion. Its activation resulted either from the blast, which caused the dynamic internal overpressure, or indicated sustained differential pressure, resulting from the airflow through the fuselage hole. Whilst the captain was flying the stricken aircraft back to the airfield, the first officer carries out the actions for the safety valve open caption. This caused him to check the differential pressure in the cabin. Now this is the pressure difference between the internal and external pressures on the cabin. He determined that it was at 0.4 psi, which meant that they could continue the approach as normal, but they discussed that they would need to reduce their rate of descent to decrease the stress on the fuselage. Both flight crew members now calmly and methodically prepared the aircraft for the approach and landing, but this was disrupted by another ECAM alert, this time for a low differential pressure. The first officer again checked the flight crew operating manual, and this informed the crew that the expected cabin pressure will be at 0 in 1.5 minutes at the current rate of descent. The crew, under pressure, in both senses of the word, to get the aircraft on the ground, understood they needed to balance the urgency to get down versus the extra stress induced by a rapid descent. They discussed their approach, and as they were heading towards the airfield, from the direction they took off, they would need to fly over or past the airport to set up for the correct runway. They decided to reduce their rate of descent to around 300 feet per minute, and they discussed that if anything further was to go wrong, they would be within the vicinity of the airfield, so could descend quicker to get down if they needed to. The captain now called air traffic control and informed them that they were inbound to the beacon at the airport descending to flight level 50, and they were preparing for a visual approach to runway 05. They further informed air traffic control that they were having a decompression problem and that they would be arriving overhead to the airport, but they did not declare an emergency at this time, although air traffic control were aware they were having issues and that they were on an emergency return. The flight crew were still unsure of the cause of the decompression. They discussed the possibility of a window blowout as the cause. At 0847, the flight attendant requested access to the flight deck again. She updated the crew on the condition of the cabin, informing them that one window was broken, and again asked if this was dangerous. It would appear that even within the cabin, there was still confusion surrounding the cause of the incident. The captain informed her that they would be on the ground in 5 to 6 minutes, so to prepare the cabin for landing. In the cabin, there was still a widespread feeling of fear. The outside air is still rushing through the cabin, with the overwhelming sound of the airflow hitting the hole in the fuselage. Some passengers are out of their seats, with the flight attendants repeatedly asking them to remain seated. The flight attendant now prepared the cabin for landing, informing the passengers that they are due to land in 5 minutes. The captain flies a teardrop pattern over the airfield to reduce the altitude of the aircraft and to remain visual with the runway. He finally rolls the aircraft to the right onto the centerline and brings the stricken aircraft towards the runway. At 0853, with a firm landing of 1.5 G, Flight 159 lands safely on runway 05 at Mogadishu. After bringing the aircraft to a stop and shutting down, the passengers were able to disembark. Apart from the attacker who was blown from the aircraft, 3 passengers sustained injuries from the attack, with everyone else surviving with no injuries. As the last of the passengers step onto solid ground, a palpable sense of relief washes over them. The true scale of the damage could now be observed by the crew. The area surrounding seat 16F had been completely blown out, but also secondary shrapnel had impacted the top of the right engine. Thanks to the swift actions of the cabin crew and the calm piloting skills of the flight crew, what could have been a tragedy of unimaginable proportions was averted on Daallo Airlines Flight 159. That, and a side of luck and incompetence from the attacker. I used a bit of an artistic license to simulate the timer on the explosive. It was believed during the investigation that a timer was used, but due to the explosion, this could not be determined. But also due to the phase of flight that the explosion occurred, it supports this theory. If the explosion had gone off at a higher altitude during the cruise, this would have been a much different story. The pressures acting on the fuselage would have been much greater, and the explosive decompression much more violent. With the cancellation of the Turkish Airlines flight, the cruise was most likely the targeted phase of flight, but due to the delay because of the flight transfer, they were luckily only at 10,000 feet. Either that, or the attacker believed they were higher than they were. Equally, the shrapnel from the explosion could have impacted more vital areas of the aircraft if the seat placement was different. That being said, even with the conditions that were faced, the aircraft proved to be excellent at handling the damage to the fuselage in flight, and the actions of the cabin and flight crew ensured a safe conclusion to this event. The Serbian captain stated after the event, "I think it was a bomb. Luckily the flight controls were not damaged, so I could return and land at the airport. Something like this has never happened in my flight career. We lost pressure in the cabin. Thank God it ended well." In the following days, Al-Shabaab took responsibility for the attack. In the investigation that followed this incident, 10 people were convicted for the attack. 8 of them were employees at the airport, with jobs ranging from security, immigration officers, and police officers, with 2 people receiving life sentences, one being a former security official at the airport, and the other one who financed the attack. Both of them were discovered to be members of Al-Shabaab. The attacker who carried out the attack was found deceased on the ground in the vicinity of the airport. For the position Flight 159 found itself in, the end result was a positive one. Through a bit of luck but also incredible crew resource management in a heavy stress environment, the crew were able to recover the aircraft using excellent airmanship assisted by their standard operating procedures to ensure all the passengers survived this attack. I hope you found this video interesting. Please let me know what you think down below. I do read all the comments, even the ones that tell me that I'm an AI voice. I can assure you that this is my voice. I might have to include myself in some videos to prove it at some point. But please let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.